Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Arm Medicine workshops. For this one, Nicola Rennie will be discussing the topic of no more copy and paste, parameterized plots and reports with R and Quarto. Nicola is a data visualization specialist focused on communicating complex quantitative information to diverse audiences. She co-authored the Royal Statistical Society's guidance on data visualization best practices. She serves on the editorial board of Significance magazine and is the founding organizer of Our Ladies Lancaster. Today, she'll show us how to eliminate repetitive reporting work by writing custom ggplot2 functions and using Quarto to generate parameterized reports across HTML, Word, and PDF documents from a single command. Nicola, please take it from here.
Thank you very much. All right, just share. Yep. All right. Okay, so yeah, do feel free to stick any questions you've got in the chat. I will do my very best to answer them. I might need to go away and look up some answers. But welcome to the sort of parameterized reporting workshop with Quarto. So yeah, as it's just been said, I'm a data viz specialist. I work with R, Python, D3. My background's in statistics and data science consultancy, and I do a lot of data viz stuff. So what we're going to do today is a combination of some slides, some live coding examples, and some exercises for you to participate in. Okay. Do ask questions throughout. Parameterized reporting, Quarto, R, ggplot2 are all huge topics. So there will probably be some things I won't cover that you might have questions about. The workshop resources are online, and that includes these slides, as well as some examples and some of the exercise solutions. So I'll just drop that link in the chat again in case anyone's joined and can't get the Zoom history. And that website will stay up, so you can always refer back to that if you need to. So before we jump into parameterized reporting, we're going to take a sort of a little bit of a step back and start by thinking about parameterized plots, specifically with ggplot2, but you can sort of apply this to any plotting package that you prefer. So the idea of parameterized plotting is that you're creating a plot where some aspect of that chart is controlled by at least one parameter. Right? So this is most commonly, it's usually a time period. Okay, so you might be creating the same chart for a monthly report each month. It might be a geographic region. Okay, so the same chart but for different areas. Or it might be something like some assumptions about the data. Okay, so for example, like what model you're applying. And the idea is that changing this parameter changes what's in the plot, but everything else that's in the plot can sort of exist the way it currently does or be determined from that parameter. So rather than repeating your code and copying and pasting that plotting code to get 7 plots for 7 geographic regions, what we want to do is parameterize that plot, essentially make a function so that we can call it 7 times, and it keeps our code nice and sort of neat and reusable. And that's the whole point. Like we don't want to repeat ourselves. You might, if you've kind of done this sort of thing before of creating the same similar plots multiple times, and then you want to do something small like change a tiny little bit of the theme, you then have to go and like change it multiple times. So it's much quicker to make different versions of the same plot, especially when you're tweaking the styling and the themes. It keeps your scripts nice and short and easy to read because you're not copying and pasting code. You can put your functions at the top or in a different script, and then it's just the let's actually make the charts code. And it keeps a really consistent layout between plots. Okay? It's easy to accidentally change things in one version of a plot and forget to update it in other ones if you're copying and pasting. But when we parameterize them, you get a really nice consistent layout. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to start by creating variables that define the data you're plotting. Okay, so if it's something like monthly reports, let's just start by creating a variable that defines the month we are currently interested in plotting. Okay, so the month might be April. If it was annual reports, you could say the year is equal to 2024, 2025, whatever. Okay, so rather than sort of try to parameterize it all at once and jump straight into functions, what you can do instead is just sort of create your initial plot, then sort of take out the parameters, stick them in these variables, and then put it in a function. So it's sort of step by step. Don't sort of be put off or be kind of like scared by thinking, oh, I have to write functions sort of straight away. Okay. Variables don't necessarily have to be about data. Okay. Um, if you look at some of my plotting code, what you'll see is that I often use things like variables for like colors and fonts or even output types. And that means, if you want to change all of the fonts in your plots, change one variable and it will update it everywhere. And then we build the functions. So we take those variables that we created, stick them in as a function argument, and our plot code goes in the middle. Okay? You might have some defaults. Okay? Um, so if you want your plotting function to allow people to change the color, but you say, okay, I have a preferred one that I'm most likely to use, put that in as a default. You can change it if you need to, but you don't have to. Okay. All right. Um, so let's jump over to a live demo. Okay. So you will find the code for the examples in the examples tab. I am going to live code them, so I can't promise they'll look exactly um, as uh, as the examples do. Okay. So for this initial example, you can either do it in an R script or you can do it in a Quarto document. It is entirely up to you. I'm going to do it in an R script initially because that's what I tend to do. So what we're going to do first of all is get ourselves some data. Okay. So for these examples, I'm going to use the Gapminder package. Okay, so if you haven't heard of the Gapminder package before, it's a nice little data package that has this kind of famous data set looking at sort of the relationship between life expectancy, GDP, population, and how that's changed over time. Um, I'm hoping this code is big enough for you to see. If you want me to increase the size, do drop a message in the chat and I'll do what I can. Okay. So what we want to do is, let's say we'll make a plot of how life expectancy has changed in Asia over time. Okay. So I'm going to start by filtering the data. Okay. So I'm going to use filter from dplyr. So what I want to do is make sure I'm just going to load all of the tidyverse because that's quicker. So I'm going to filter continent is equal to Asia. Okay, so we just have a slightly smaller data set to work from. Okay, so we still have country, continents, all the same values, the year, life expectancy, population, and GDP. And then we're going to make a plot. Okay, so I'm not going to do anything fancy. Okay, we got ggplot2. So in ggplot2, our first argument is always the data. Okay, so that's going to be our Gapminder data. And I'm going to look at the distribution over time. Choose whatever plot type you prefer to do that. I'm going to just make a box plot. Okay. And we put in our aesthetic mapping. So we have mapping on the x-axis, we will have year. And on the y-axis, we will have life expectancy. So what this should do is show us how is life expectancy changing over time. Okay. And what you'll notice is that it doesn't really look the way you'd want it to. And that's because year is currently uh, a number, right? So with box plots, we want that to be a category or a factor, right? So then we get to see this sort of box plot with this overall increasing trend over time. What we might also want to do with our charts is add some labels. So I'm going to remove the one on the x-axis because it's kind of obvious it's a year. On the y-axis, I'm going to say it's life expectancy um, in years. And I'm going to add a title, which is life expectancy in Asia. Okay. Right. So we've got a very, very basic plot. Okay. It's not particularly fancy, but it's fine. So this plot is specifically for life expectancy in Asian countries. If I wanted to make the same plot, but for countries in Europe, what things would I need to change? Okay. And I guess there's sort of like two main things I would need to change. First thing is the data. Okay, so I filtered the data to a specific continent, so I would need to change this value um, to Europe. The other thing I would need to change is the title. Okay, so it also specifies which continent I've filtered it to within the title. But if I change just those two things, it would change the plot essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, okay, let's call it choose continent, and I'm going to set that to Asia. And then rather than hard coding in Asia in here, I can pass that variable in, right? And it works in exactly the same way. What I also want to do is pass that into this uh, sort of title. Now in R, there's lots of different ways to combine text with uh, values of variables. My preferred method is the glue package. Okay. So the idea of the glue package is that you wrap your text inside this glue function, and then you type it in like a normal string. If you want to replace, let's say, Asia in this example, with a variable, you put that variable in and you put it inside curly brackets. Okay. There are base R sort of versions of glue, so like paste or paste zero, which work pretty similarly. I quite like glue because it's nice and readable, like you can still read the sentence quite clearly. So if I run this, make sure you load the glue package. It's one of those packages that I always expect to be in the sort of core tidyverse packages, but it's not. Okay. And what you see is that there's absolutely no difference in our plot. Okay. We've parameterized it. Okay. We've taken that continent variable out. But what this means is that if we change this to, let's say, Europe, and we run our code, we get the same plot, but for different data. Okay. And we also have that title nicely updated. So, I mean, this is fine, and we could just keep it like this, okay, just with this sort of variable at the top of our script. But what's usually better is to turn it into a function, okay? So we could create, I'm going to call it continent plot, which is a function with an argument choose continent. And I'm just going to take all that code we've written and put it inside the function. Okay. I'm going to be explicit about what my function returns. By default, it will return the last thing it creates. so it should work fine without it. Okay. One other tiny little change I'm going to make to this, which is good practice to make, but technically it will work even if you don't, is rather than passing the data sort of hard coded within the function, I'm going to put an argument into the function, which is data equals gapminder, and replace this. Okay. So what this is saying is take the data that I pass in as the thing we're filtering on. Okay. And that means that if you like get a new data set from somewhere else, okay, so if you, for example, get a different data set every month, you can pass it into the function, okay, rather than having to like load it into your environment. So if we take that function and then we can call that function, and if we pass in the name of a continent, so we've got Europe, we can go back to Asia, okay, just by passing in the name of the continent, okay, and that will work for any of the continents that are available in the gapminder data set. Okay. All right. Okay. So it's your turn. Um, so what I'd like you to do is something very similar to what I've just done. And that's basically do the same thing, but instead of parameterizing based on the continent, if you parameterize based on the year, okay, so you can create a particular plot for a different year of data. Okay, so what you need to do is create a variable to define a year. There is, if you go on to exercises, okay, there is already some code for you to work with, so you don't need to write the sort of plotting code or the filtering code. It's there for you, so you can copy that code and then edit it to use that year variable, okay, and then turn it into a function. Okay, I can indeed share the link again. All right. All right, so I'll give you some time to work on that. If you do get stuck or you've got any other questions, please just drop them in the chat. Okay. So if you go to the exercises page, you can see exercise 1, okay, and you've got that code to edit there. Okay. All right, we've got a couple of people who are done, which is excellent. So there are solutions for the exercises online. So what we're going to be doing in this workshop is kind of building on each section. So we're going to be using this plotting function, this parameterized function that you just created in the next set of exercises. So if you do get stuck or you sort of missed a bit, you can go to the solutions and use those or use your own. Okay. So I think most, like, quite a few people are done. So I will move on to the next section, unless anybody desperately wants some more time. All right. So we're kind of going to move on now to, I guess, like the core part of this workshop, which is all about parameterized reports with Quarto. So although creating the same plot multiple times with slightly different data is a like a fairly common task, it's probably even more common that you're creating a whole report, right? You're quite often not just making one plot, it's a report, it might have multiple plots, it's probably going to have some text. And again, it's a similar idea that it's going to be the same or similar reports multiple times. So what we're going to do to make our reports is use something called Quarto. Okay, so if you haven't heard of Quarto before, it's basically an open source publishing system that lets you combine text, so narrative text, the same way you would write it in a Word document, with code that makes plots, images, tables, etc. Okay? And the nice thing about Quarto, as well as the fact that it can do all that, is it lets you create these fully reproducible documents. And that's really useful when you're trying to create the same report multiple times. If you can reproduce it, you can save time. So the examples we're going to do today are all going to be using R, but Quarto does work for other languages, including Python, Julia, and Observable. So it's essentially like R Markdown, but like bigger and better. Okay? And you get a lot of different output formats. Okay, so you can make HTML documents, PDFs, websites, presentations, all of that. We'll come back to output formats a little bit later. So in terms of what goes into a Quarto document, there's kind of like two separate bits of it. So at the top of a Quarto document, we have what we call the YAML header. So it goes sort of inside these two sets of three dashes. And that's where you put in properties that apply to the entire document. Okay, so things like the title or the format or some different options. Okay, and then after that, you have the content. It could basically be anything. Okay, it can be just some text, it could be some images, it could be code that makes tables and plots, it could be equations, it could be references, lots of different things you can put in there. In terms of output types, you can make lots and lots of different things. The default is to make an HTML document, and that's mainly what we're going to make today, partly because it's a default and partly because it's very quick to render. But we will look a little bit later at how you can change what the content of your report is based on whether you're rendering it to like HTML or PDF. So for example, if you're making a website or an HTML document, you can put a bunch of interactive stuff in, okay, like interactive charts with some tooltips or some drop downs, but that's not going to work in PDF if someone says, I really want a PDF of this report. So we'll look at ways to sort of switch little bits of your code depending on the output format. Now, the thing that makes parameterized reporting very nice in Quarto are these things called parameters. Okay? So one of the sort of document-wide options you can have in this YAML is a thing called params. Okay? So this is kind of like a specific option. And then you can create any parameters you want. Okay? So if, for example, you have a variable that defines the year, you can turn that into a parameter in your Quarto document by just saying year, colon, and then giving it a default value. Okay, so here is 2023. Okay. You can do something similar with R Markdown, okay, if you haven't kind of switched to Quarto. So the nice thing about that is you can grab these parameter values that you define in the YAML for your Quarto document, and you can use them in code. And the way you access them is just params, $, and then whatever your parameter name was. So if, for example, you needed to subset your data based on a year, you would do like year is equal to params $year. That will filter your data, in this case, to 2023. Okay. You can do the same thing with Python code in Quarto. It is in our workshop, but I'll stick a little bit of Python in there so you can see that it is possible. Okay, it does work slightly differently. Okay, so you would sort of create like tags for parameters, define your parameters, and then you can use them in code. Okay, so it does work, but it's kind of like a slightly different syntax. All right, so let's make a Quarto document. So a couple of different ways to make Quarto documents in RStudio. You can do file, new file, Quarto document. Okay. And that will, hopefully, in a second, allow you to create a new document. Okay. So in here, you can put in your title, I'm just going to call it Gapminder report on life expectancy in Asia. Okay, you can put the author in if you like. Default format is HTML. I'm going to leave that. Um, you can use the visual markdown editor if you want. I'm not going to. Okay, but that will create a sort of basic document that looks a little bit like this. Okay, so we've got a title, a format, and you can see, okay, you can just type in some text. You can also add code blocks. Okay, so if you're adding a code block, you have the set of three backticks, curly brackets, and then an R to say that you've got some R code that you're going to be running in your document. Okay. One other option that I'm going to add in to the sort of document-wide YAML is under execute, you have all of these options. Okay, so eval is, do you want your code to evaluate? Echo is, do you want your code to show in the final report? And most of the time we don't, right? If you're writing a sort of report for like stakeholders, or if you're writing a journal paper, you don't really want the code to be showing. So I'm going to set that to false to hide it. And then I'm just going to save this document. I'm just going to call it example. And if I render that, okay, there you go. Takes time, okay, but there you go, okay? So you get this kind of like nicely formatted content. You get the output from this code block, but you don't get the sort of the code itself printed. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in the plot that we created earlier. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this stuff for now. And I'm going to, first of all, load all of the packages we need. Okay, so one of the things that I guess you kind of need to remember about Quarto documents is that they are sort of like self-contained. So if you have loaded a library globally in RStudio, Quarto doesn't necessarily know that you've done that because everything that it needs to make that document needs to be sort of within the document. Okay, so I'm going to create a um, a code block that loads all of the packages. Okay, so you can type out these code blocks piece by piece if you want. There is a keyboard shortcut, so Control Shift and I think it might not work on Windows particularly well, um, but you should be able to change that, okay, to have that nice keyboard shortcut. And then what we're going to do is add in our plotting code. Okay, so again, let's go back here and grab our function. Okay, you can put your function kind of like wherever you like, put it in a new code block, and then we want to call that function. Okay, so let's run that and see what happens, just to sort of check it works. Okay, um, so I guess like first thing you notice is you get all this like stuff um coming out of your library calls that you probably don't really want. So the way you can hide that is if you go warning false, okay, and that basically says don't print any of the warnings. Um, I tend not to switch that on globally because warnings are normally useful. Okay. But otherwise, we get our plot here. What we might want to do is add a caption to that plot. Okay, so again, really common in um, journal papers and reports. If you want to sort of reference a figure, it's really useful to like have a caption and describe what's in it. So in Quarto, we can add these code block chunks. Okay, so that's a hashtag and then a pipe. Okay? And then we can do fig dash cat, and you should get this sort of like predictive YAML, which is one of my favorite Quarto features. Okay? So you get fig dash cat, and then you can put in your figure caption. Okay, so it's going to be like life expectancy in Asia. Okay, you probably in reality do something a bit better than that. The other thing I'm going to do is add a label. Now, adding labels to code blocks is good practice because it can help you figure out if you have an error. It will help you determine where in your document that error is if you name things well, rather than sort of like unnamed chunk number 17. But in Quarto, if we want to add sort of figure references, so we can say, okay, look at figure one, the way we do that is by starting the label with this fig prefix. So anything that starts fig dash, Quarto is like, oh, that's a figure. I'll add a like figure one label. So if I add this label, what I can do is say, okay, like at fig life expectancy shows a like box plot over time. And then I can render that. Okay. And you get a couple of different things. One, you get this figure caption added at the bottom. Okay, so it says figure one life expectancy in Asia. That's what I put in as my caption. Okay, and you've also got this sort of figure one cross reference here. Nice thing about Quarto is that like when you hover over a figure reference, it gives you like a little preview of what the chart looks like, which is quite nice, and it automatically prefixes it with the word figure, so you don't have to type that out as well. So then what we want to do is parameterize the essentially like the whole document. Okay. So similar to the way that we sort of took this continent parameter and made it an argument in a function, we'll create a document parameter. Okay, so if we do params, okay, and then I'm just going to call it the same thing. And I'm going to put in a default value. You don't have to put in a default value, um, but it's quite useful, particularly when you're sort of developing the report to have a default value in there so you can like check it works. Okay. So what that means is that rather than passing in uh, choose continent from a sort of hard coding in which continent we want to plot in here, what we can do is do params $, choose continent. Okay. And now if we re-render that, okay, so you'll notice like some things have changed, but not everything has changed. Okay, so if you're really paying attention, you will see that the plot has changed. Okay, so on average, it's a little bit higher. Okay, and you'll see that the plot title has changed. Okay, that's because we've got this sort of parameterized here. But there's two things that haven't changed, right? One of them is the figure caption, right? A figure caption is still hard coded in with Asia, and so is our report title. So what we kind of want to do is uh, change both of those values, and that's what we will look at in a second. Is how do you sort of grab your parameters and put them into text? Okay, um, it's a little bit different depending on what it is you're trying to change. So we will fix that and we will come back to it in a second. Um, so what I'm going to get you to do, if we go back to slides, I was going to say using the parameter for tables. Okay, we can look at an example of doing the same thing for tables. Okay, so we can use this parameter directly in code. It doesn't need to be used sort of within a function. So if I load it up here, so again, in R, there's like a million packages for using for making tables. I quite like Tiny Table because it makes lots of different types of tables. What we can do is we can take our gapminder data, filter it to our parameters directly, okay, and then print it. Okay, so TT is a tiny table. Okay, so this isn't sitting in a nice parameterized plotting function. Okay, you can do it directly or write it in a function. It doesn't really matter in this example. Okay, and so you get this kind of long table here. Okay, lots and lots of data in it, but it just prints out all those values. Okay. If you wanted to add a table caption, in Quarto, the prefix is like TBL rather than fig. Okay, so you do label TBL, I don't know, continent data, and that would let you cross-reference that table as well. Okay. Okay, so it's your turn. So what you're going to do is you're going to, if you head back to the exercises and go to exercise 2, there's an example Quarto document here. Okay, so it's got a title in it already. It's got packages loading. It's got some text and a code block. So what I'd like you to do is edit that to add a parameter for the year. Then add in the plotting function that you made in exercise 1 and pass that parameter into the plotting function. Check it works. Okay. Change the value of the parameter and re-render to check again that it works and that it's correctly updating. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to work through that. Again, any questions, drop them in the chat. Okay, I'll drop in a link to exercise 2 if you need it. Any questions about this or anything else, do you just let me know and let me know when you're done. Okay. Okay. We have been going for about 50 minutes. So what I would normally suggest at this point is we may take a 5-minute break. Okay, so if you do need a little bit extra time, I mean, don't feel like you need to stare at your screen for another 5 minutes. Do take a little break, go grab a cup of tea, cup of coffee, and we'll come back at 25 past. Okay. So I will see you in 5 minutes. Okay. All right. Back and ready to get started again. We've got a question in the chat, which is a really good question. So whether someone reading your Quarto document, so if you just sort of sent them your final HTML report, whether they'd be able to sort of choose the parameters and then get the report based on that. Not sort of directly out of the box. So one thing you could do is set this up with like a Shiny app. So you could have a Shiny app that has some drop-down options that come from the data, and they you like click a button to render the report. And there are some nice functions that let you render Quarto reports sort of within Shiny. So that's one way to do it. Um, the other way to do it would be something um, almost like tabs. I'm imagining it depends. Something like choosing a date range is more complicated than choosing like one of five categories. Um, there's something in Quarto called tab sets. So you could have like five little tabs along the top, and it's like choose, like in this example, a continent, and it would show the report for that continent. Um, so there are options to do it, but it's not quite as out of the box as you might like it to be. Okay. All right. So what we're going to look at next um, is basically fixing the things that are currently wrong with this parameterized version of the report. Okay, so our parameterized report at the moment says that we want to create a report um, based on data in Europe. And at the moment, we've got a couple of problems with that. One is the title, and the other one's a figure caption, which are both sort of hard coded in as Asia. So we're going to look at some ways to fix that. Then we'll look at rendering multiple reports. Okay, so there's been a couple of questions in the chat, and we will be coming on to that. So looking at, okay, let's say you want to make a report for each continent in Asia, and you just want to generate like all of the reports. How do you do that like nice and efficiently? And then after that, we'll look at two other sort of separate things. One is conditional content that I sort of mentioned briefly earlier. So how do you edit what appears in your report depending on your output format, or potentially values in your data. Okay? And then after that, we're going to look at parameterized report sections. Okay, so rather than generating seven different reports, what you might want is actually one report with seven different sections that are structured very similarly. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at in the rest of the session. So the first thing we need to figure out though is how do we fix the issues with the text? Okay, so we've kind of looked at parameterizing plots, but what about text? Okay, so basically there's two ways to add R code into a Quarto report. One of them you've already seen. So you add a code block and it generates something. The second option is when you want to use values from your code in a sentence. Right? So for example, the number of rows is like 1,001 or something. Okay? Now, of course, you could just compute that value and then type it into your sentence. That's very dangerous though, because it's so easy to forget to update that number. Okay. If we use inline code, we get that number from our data dynamically. So if the data changes, the sentence updates. Okay? So if you were to run this, uh, the the sentence would read out and display in your Quarto report just as a normal sentence, but it's actually generated by R code. Okay? You can also add R code into your figure captions. Okay? So again, saying something like the number of rows is whatever, or creating a summary of the data. It's a little bit like different. It's a little bit weird in my opinion. So normally you'd put inline R code in with a single backtick and then a lowercase r. So it's kind of similar to code blocks. Okay? If you're putting them in figure captions, you do an exclamation mark, then EXPR for expression, and then you stick your R code in quotation marks. Okay. I don't expect you to remember that. I have to look it up every time I do it anyway. Okay. But what that does is something very similar to what you saw on the previous slide is writes that text with those values dynamically for you. Okay. So let's have a little look at how we might do that. Okay. So what I could do is edit this sentence. Okay, so at the moment it says figure one shows a box plot over time in, okay, single backtick R, then params, dollar sign, choose consonant. Okay, and make sure that's closed as well. So if I render that, okay, you can see that it just looks like a normal sentence. Okay, so we've got this inline R code executing, but it to an end user you can't tell. Okay, it just looks like a completely normal sentence. Okay, and that works in the title as well. Okay, um, so we can inside the title do um, backtick R params dollar sign underscore choose continent, okay, and close that as well. Okay, so this is like copy and paste is the exact same thing that can go in the title. It's one of those things that I didn't actually expect it to work, but it does work, and that's very nice. Okay, so even though like the title appears before params, um, and yeah, it's very nice that it works, and that updates our title. So now our title is updating based on that parameter, so you can use it in the title of the sentence, and our chart is also updated. The last thing we need to update is this figure caption, with that slightly weird syntax. Okay, so uh, dollar sign EXBR for expression, and then some way of generating that string. You can do it using glue, or you can do it as an example using paste 0. Okay, so I could have life expectancy in, and then params dollar sign choose consonant. Okay. Um, I appreciate that it doesn't feel super easy to write because when you put your code sort of in quotation marks, you lose some of that syntax highlighting. Um, you also need to be a little bit careful about quotation marks because it's expecting your R code to be in quotation marks. If you're using quotation marks to write strings, you need to combine sort of single and double quotes, which is a little bit annoying. But hey, that now updates. Okay, so now every aspect of our report is based on our parameter. So if we change that parameter, the whole report from the title, the text, the chart title, the chart itself, figure caption, and the table data all change based on this, but the layout of the chart is and the report as a whole is still consistent. Okay. So it's your turn again to do some work. So for exercise 3, what I'd like to do is edit um the sentence. So in the example report that says shows a plot of median life expectancy in the year 1952, change that to come from the document parameter and fix the title and figure caption as well. Okay, right. Yeah, there's a comment in the chat about like using the parameter in the title, um, which yeah. I think it's great because it feels like it shouldn't work, but it does because you're using parameter sort of before you've defined it, um, and also sort of writing inline R code in the title, um, which I don't know feels a bit weird, but it's very nice. All right. So what we're going to look at now is rendering multiple reports. Okay, so we've got this parameterized report, and we can sort of type in the parameter that we want at the top and render it, and that creates a report in this case for Europe. But like at least to some extent, the point of this is that we can create multiple reports from that one document. So I mean, what you could do is like manually go in and change the parameter value and then hit render and then save it somewhere and cycle it in. You could also press the parameters in one at a time in the command line. Okay. So you can in the terminal, you can type like quarto render and pass your parameters in. And again, kind of like do it manually and pass all those different values in. But there's a better way. So there's two kind of packages we need for this. One of them is the Quarto R package. So the Quarto R package is separate from like Quarto um, as a piece of software. But what it does have is some nice little functions um, that let you do things in a kind of more R friendly way. And one of the functions that exists in the Quarto R package is the Quarto render function. Okay? And that's essentially an alternative to hitting that render button. Okay, so instead of hitting that, you can do uh, Quarto Quarto render. Okay, and you can pass in the input file. Right? So it does the exact same thing, but just sort of from code rather than clicking a button. So that kind of lets us like render one report in an R way. But then what you could do, right, is you could do a for loop, for example. Okay? You could get your vector of all your continent names or all your years, months, whatever it is, and then loop over them is one way. What I would suggest you do is use the per package um, and map over all of your possible parameter values, so all of your different years. And we can use the walk functions from per to call that function on every input parameter. If you are more of a base R person, the apply family of functions is like very similar. Okay, so let's have a look at how this actually works. Okay, so I guess first thing to remember when we're kind of using this quarto render function is that we want to make sure we're not doing that inside the quarto document, right? So we don't want to be putting quarto render in here. We can do it in a separate R script. I mean, you can do it in the console directly if you want. I'm just going to open up a new R script. Okay. If you were to put it in the Quark document, you'd end up in like some horrendous loop, okay, and with some weird error messages. So we'll stick it in a separate document. And then we have the Quarto render functions. So the first argument to that is the input. Okay, so that's the like the input Quarto file, the name of that. So in our case, it's just example .qmd. It could be named absolutely anything. And then what you can do in here is there's another argument, execute underscore params, and that's where you can pass in your parameters. Okay. Now, parameters get passed in as a list because you could have multiple parameters, right? Here we've just got one, which is continent. It could be like you could have as many parameters as you like. So I'm going to say render my report with the continent parameter equal to put Europe in here. So Let's put Americas. Just want to check what the continent values are. Okay. So we got 5 options here. Okay, so let's see what this one looks like. So I want to make sure I've loaded the Quarto package, and then I run Quarto render. Oh, that's not good. That's because it's not called continent. It's called choose continent. Okay. And unfortunately, doesn't do uh spelling for you or memory. Okay. Um, but you do get an error if you try to pass in a parameter that doesn't exist. Okay. Um, so that's created this updated report. So you can see that even though you're using the Quarto render function rather than clicking the button, it still appears in the viewer tab. So you get this updated report. Okay. So now what we want to do is rather than just manually passing in one continent, we need to get to sort of map over all of them. So we're going to do that using the per package. Okay. And per has quite a few functions in it. The ones you're probably most familiar with if you've used it before is the map set of functions. We're going to use functions called walk. What the walk function does is it lets you call a function for its side effects. Okay, so we don't want to output anything in R itself. What we want to do is make some HTML reports. Okay? So we use walk instead of map. So our first argument in walk is going to be what are we mapping over? In this case, it's going to be the unique continents. Okay? You can pass these in as a vector or just grab them from the data. Okay, so that gives us our 5 different options for continent. And then the function we want to run is this one here. Okay. Our input file doesn't change, okay, but our execute params arguments do. Okay. We want that to be .x. So basically for each value in .x, put that in as a parameter. So what this should do is generate a report for every value of the uh of the continents. Okay, so I'm going to run that, and if you watch what happens, it's going to take a little while. Okay, so you can see it's processing it. So that's it doing the first one. Okay, you can see it's life expectancy in Asia. It's done. Okay, now it's like processing the second one. Okay, while that's running through, I'll answer the question in the chat. Is like, why do we want to use walk instead of map again? So if you like, it will work with map, but it when you run with it with map, what that essentially does is like it keeps returning empty list elements to the console, which is really annoying when you're like if you're cycling over multiple reports. Okay. So when you use map, it's sort of expecting you to return an object in R as a result of that. So you run map and you end up with a list of objects in R. Here we don't want a list of objects in R, right? Like we don't there's nothing in R that's going to come out of rendering this report. What like it's kind of called calling it for its side effects. The side effect is generating an HTML report. That HTML report doesn't exist as an object in R, it exists like as a side effect somewhere else, right? So it's run through that list. So you can see that what's displayed in this viewer tab is like the last of those reports. Okay, so it's kind of showing the most recent one, which is what we would expect. However, if you look in your files, okay, if you either within R or within your file explorer, um, what you'll see is there's not as many reports as you quite like. Okay, we should have five. Okay, we should have five different values for the continent. So like why is there only one HTML report here? The reason is that it's overwriting it. So the when you render a report called example.qmd, the default name is of the output is example.html. So every time you render it with a different continent, it just creates another example.html file on top of the one that exists and basically overwrites the previous one. So you've created five reports, but you only actually have the last one. So what we need to do is make sure that every report has a different output name. So what we can do here is the output file, and then what we're going to do is use glue again, and we're going to do like report underscore dot x dot html. So what this is going to do is the name of the HTML output for like Asia is going to be report underscore Asia dot html. Okay. So I don't want this to take ages, so I'm only going to do this for two of them, right? Just to save us a little bit of time staring at the um the console. Okay. So you can see like in the output here, it's kind of telling you what one it's currently working on. So the moment it's generating report underscore Asia. So good question in chat. Is where are these going? So by default, they just go in the same place as your .qmd file. Okay, so if you've got your example.qmd file like somewhere, it's just going to be in exactly the same place. I'm just going to refresh that. Okay, and you can see here we've got the both versions of those reports there. Um, so nice question of like if you've got more than like five, um, you probably don't want to be sitting staring at the console. You probably want to go away from your laptop and do something else. Um, I think Wok does have the progress bar. So if you set like dot progress equals to true, when you run it, it creates like a little progress bar in the console, and it will tell you how far through this list it is. Um, I think there's some packages in R that make them look fancy as well. So that's is a nice way. The other thing I would recommend doing with this is if it is a big like list of things, you can use the beepr package, which will like make your computer beep at you when it's finished, which is sort of both annoying and helpful. Okay. Another question in chat, which is another good question, is can you um, render the report into PDF? Yes, you can. The the best way to do it would probably be to change the format in here. But we will come on to that in a little bit later about switching between output formats. Okay. Um, the other question about paths in output files. Um, I really want that to be yes, but the last time I checked, no, you can't, um, which is super annoying. What you can do, so I find like this quite annoying. I quite like my files and folders to be quite organized, so I don't really like my output files mixed in with my source files. It annoys me. Um, so what you can do is create something called a Quarto project. Okay? So the way you create a Quarto project is you create a file, uh, which is underscore Quarto dot YAML dot YML. Okay. And what you're doing in here is this type, which uh give me 1 second. Um and you should be able to do project, then output directory, and you can put it anywhere you like. By default, I think it goes into a folder called site because it like as in sort of website. If you put it in output, when you render, where is it? This. Okay. That'll be slow. Okay. So you can kind of see like this progress bar kind of coming up here. So it's halfway through, it's got about 18 seconds to go. All right. So what you can see here is that my output files aren't in the same place as my source file. They're all in here. Okay. Um, which is kind of nice, right? Like you can just bundle all of your reports into one place. It's not a perfect solution to not being able to use paths as you would like to in Quarto, but it's kind of, I don't know, better than not doing that. There's one other kind of little um issue, I guess, that we might currently have with our reports in that if you were to uh, open them, it's opened over here. Okay, so this is our report for Europe. Yeah, not going to do that. Meant to do this. Okay. Um, Now what you might notice is okay. So here's our report on Europe. Looks great. Okay. Here's our report on Asia. And it doesn't really look the way you want it to, right? It's got the wrong chart in it. Now, the reason for that is because the charts are sort of rendered as files and then saved, okay, which is fine. But what it does is it sticks them all in this folder underscore files, and it's got the same problem as we previously had with the the report being overwritten. Okay, so although we're generating a new report each time, it's pulling in images that are being overwritten every time. So we've only got one image. We should have multiple images. So the easiest way around this is to do format HTML embed resources true. Okay, so by default, Quarto doesn't embed resources, and that's kind of, I guess, one of the main differences from R Markdown. By R Markdown, it sticks them all together and embeds them by default. In Quarto, it doesn't. I think the reason for that is it's quicker, right? It's quicker to render things separately and then only stick them together when you need to. But now, if we run this, what you should see is multiple um, reports, but you shouldn't get the sort of example files in a separate folder. Okay, it will just create HTML reports and everything will be sort of properly stuck in that folder. Okay. Okay, so if you go into output, okay, example files is still kind of hanging around because it was there earlier, but if we go to our report on Asia, okay, now it's the correct image, right? Um, so it's sort of the image is sort of stuck to the HTML report rather than reading in from a file. Okay, so that's kind of something to be a little bit careful with if you are rendering multiple reports like this. Okay, right. Slides. Here we go. All right. Um, so it's your turn again. Um, so render a version of the report that you created in the previous exercise, using the Quarto render function, and then render a version of your report for all years in the data. Okay, so doing something similar and mapping over all possible years. Okay. Um, Again, if you get stuck or got any questions, post them in the chat. Um, the one question in chat is, can you have multiple params? Yes, you can have multiple parameters. You could, like, you can have as many as you want in here. So I could have something like year, like 2007, and then I can filter, uh, like year equals year in here. Um, what do you mean by that? Like that have to align? Hmm. So what is okay? So I would probably do like that. So yes, it's less of a quartal question, and I think like more of a walk question. So you can do. Let me copy and paste this in case I break it. Um, so you can have walk two, which is like you would have like dot y. I don't know, like a vector of years in here, and then you could pass year equals dot y in here. Now, what that's going to do is not what you're asking about. So you're asking, so this would create a report for every combination of X and Y. If you only wanted some combinations, then you would sort of pre-filter that data. So let me think. So you have Gapminder, um, um, year, and continent in like Europe, or year is like 1952 and continent is Asia. Okay. And then I would select the columns that create those parameters. So that's going to be continent and year and get the distinct values. Okay. So that's the combinations you want. So as long as you can get a list or like a data frame with the combinations of parameters you want, you can pass those in. Walk. Love that. then what I would do, so this is like your params data frame. And what I would do in here is create a sequence. So from one up to the number of rows in your data frame of parameters. And then this would be like params df um continent dot x. And you could do that in there. I think, yeah, that would create versions of the reports with particular combinations of parameters. So, yes, you can. Okay. How are we getting on? Well, I've been waffling while you're all trying to concentrate. All right. I can see a few people are done now. So I'm gonna start on the next section before we take another break because there's kind of like two different um things I want to show you in the next section. Okay. Um, so we're going to talk about something called conditional content, um, which in Quarto basically means show this content in the final report based on some conditions. And I guess there's kind of like two main types of conditions you might be interested in. So one of them um, that's pretty common and is actually kind of built into Quarto as a way of doing conditional content is conditioning on output format. Okay, so the idea is that you display particular bits of your report only for specific output formats. Okay, so there's two options, kind of like the inverse of each other. You have content visible or content hidden. Okay, so you can sort of hide or show it by default, and you can hide or show it either only when the output format is a specific format or like if it's any other type of uh, output format. Okay? So there are the way you do it is basically you have these triple colon blocks. Okay, so they are in Quarto kind of called like fenced divs, and you put all of your options in curly brackets. Okay. Question in chat is like, is typed as a format? Yes, it is. So if you do like Quarto conditional contents, I'm sure there is a list in here, okay, of format matching, which I'll just stick in the chat. Okay, so here you've got when format equals HTML. That's kind of the like alias for all of these formats. Okay. Um, so you have got these different options here. I I'm sure it does work with types. It's not in this list. Um, but I think it's types is essentially a PDF format. So if you're making a PDF through types, it should still work when specifying format equals PDF, I think. But we can test that in the examples and see if we break the examples and see what happens. Okay. The other thing you can do is like condition on parameters or data values. Okay. So if you are the way I started doing this was when I was teaching and I had a parameter that was sort of hide or show answers. So I would be able to generate two versions of a report from one source file. One output file was just the questions for my students, and then one output file was the questions and the answers for me when I'm marking. Okay? Um, and it is kind of like a nice way to just keep it all in one place. So you can use these content hidden. Okay, so you can use content visible or content hidden without the like output format specifier to hide or show whatever is in it. And this is my kind of hacky solution to this is basically use some R code to evaluate whether or not uh, you print this output. Okay, it will make more sense when um, I show you an example of this. Okay. There are a couple of other solutions to this. So one of them is things called profiles. Okay, so these, I showed you an example earlier of creating a project file using a Quarto YAML file. You can kind of have multiple profiles within a project. Okay, so you could create in the sort of like questions and solutions example, you can create a profile Quarto under dash solutions and sort of say when the profile is equal to solutions, then show it. And it's a slightly like neater version of this. Both of them work, and which one is the right one will like depend on what it is you're trying to do. Okay, so in the questions and solutions one, like whether it's questions or solutions isn't something that comes from the data. So profile configurations is a nice option. If you wanted to show or hide content, depending on, like in our Gapminder example, let's say if the continent is Europe, you want to include like a little paragraph of text that explains some caveats in the data or like something about the data specific to that value, then you're kind of going to need to use R for that because you need to check which like data value you're currently on. Okay. Um, gonna leave you on a slight cliffhanger because we've been going for another hour. So we'll take another 5 minute break, and then when we come back, we'll do a live demo, looking at HTML and PDF output, and we'll look at some interactive charts versus static charts, and then I'll show you an example of hiding content for specific parameters. Okay. So if you come back again at 25 past, I will see you in 5 minutes. I'm going to go grab some more coffee. All right. Um, we're back. Right. So we'll move on to the final set of examples. Uh, Second from last set of examples. Looking at conditional content. Okay, so we're going to go into a live demo of making some interactive and static charts based on uh, output format. Okay. So by default, we render to HTML format. Okay, so we've got, I'm going to remove embed resources true for now to try and make this a little bit quicker at rendering. So one of the nice things about HTML outputs is that you can include interactive stuff, right? So you could have uh, an interactive chart with some tooltips or some hover. Right? So I might add an example of that in. So I guess there's two main packages that work really nicely for making interactive charts with ggplot2. Um, there's the like ggiraf/giraffe, however you pronounce it, package. There's also the plotly package. I do kind of prefer the first one, but I'm gonna use the ggplotly function, which takes your ggplot and just converts the whole thing to an interactive chart. So if I save my plot output to an object and pass it in to ggplotly, when I render that, okay, you get this interactive chart. Okay, so when you hover over the box plot, you get like all the summary stats. Um, it's not super nicely presented, but that's not the point of this workshop. Okay. Um, so the problem with this is that okay, it works perfectly fine in HTML almost. Um, but if I was to output this to like PDF or a Word document, um, like interactive charts don't translate. So some of them will print like almost like a screenshot of it. Some of them might not appear at all. It kind of depends what package you've used to make the interactive charts. Okay. Now, one solution is just get rid of the interactive charts and stick with the static ones, but like that's not ideal. Okay. So what what we can do is say, okay, when the output format is HTML, use the interactive one. Otherwise, put the static one in. Okay? So what we're going to do is going to create one of these little fence diffs and say um, content visible. Okay, so show this content when the format is HTML. And we put our ggplotly inside that. So that interactive chart is only going to render when it's HTML. And then I just want the static ggplot. Okay, so get rid of the ggplotly and just put in the object g and say uh unless the format is HTML. Okay, so show it unless it's HTML and then don't show it. Okay. Now, if you if you're really paying attention, what you might have noticed is this. Okay, you also got a little warning when you're rendering it in the background job to say it can't resolve the cross-reference. The reason for that is because this sort of fig label and fig caption are in are not in the code block that produces the plot output. Now, the issue we've got now is we've got two different code blocks that output figure one, depending on um like which format it is. Now, I did try this yesterday, and you can duplicate this. Okay, so you could take this out of here and put it in here like this. Okay, and have the same thing twice. Usually Quarto returns an error if you have two code blocks with the same label. For me, this didn't return an error, which I didn't expect, but it also didn't work. So for the if I was to render this in PDF, I still got this like cross-ref doesn't work. So what I'm gonna do instead is I'm gonna get rid of the figure label and caption from within the code blocks, and I'm gonna put them around both. Okay, let me just get rid of that table for now. Okay, so this is another fence div sitting with the content visible sitting inside it. And what you can do in Quarto is you can add like cross-reference labels and captions to any like fence div. So if I do fig dash life dash expectancy, that's the equivalent of having uh the label, right? You use a hashtag at the start, and then I can do fig dash cap equals, okay, and then I can do life expectancy in, and I want to use my parameters again. Because this is kind of like plain text div rather than a code block figure caption, we can just use the single backticks. Okay. And this says sort of this section of the report is figure one. And in either case, we only get one of these. So if I render this, let's see what happens. Hopefully this works. Okay. So figure one is fixed. It looks as we'd expect. Okay. So a little bit cropped and scrolly, but that's fine. Okay. But everything else is as we would expect. We've got this nice interactive chart um, with the kind of hover effects. Okay. If I change the format to something else, right? Um, you can change it to PDF here. I'm gonna try types and see if this works. I hope it does. So if you haven't, some of you might not have heard of types before. So types is another way of making PDFs. Okay, so the default is Quarto uses something called LaTeX to make PDFs. Some of you might have experienced LaTeX errors and things that are a bit odd. Types is, in my opinion, nicer than LaTeX and is also quicker. Okay, and you can see here we've got our nice chart. Okay, it's not the interactive version; it's the kind of static version, but it appears as you would expect in the types to PDF. And we've got this, still got this sort of figure one cross reference appearing correctly. Okay. The next thing I want to show you is something that looks a bit complicated or looks I guess, like a bit odd. Okay. So let's say that for my report, the data that I have collected on Europe, like there's maybe some caveats or some extra information I need to include in the report, but only in the report for Europe. Okay, the rest of them I don't need that extra text. I only need it for one specific report. So what we can do is we can say, okay, like hide the content unless it's the continent parameter is Europe. Now, unfortunately, there's not kind of a built-in way in Quarto to do that, as far as I'm aware. But we have R, so we can do it with R. Okay. So what I'm going to do is create some if statements, first of all. Okay. And say, like, if the params of choose continent is equal to Europe. Okay. If if the parameter is Europe, what I want to do is return this, right? So if the parameter is Europe, I want a little content visible block, and I'm going to save that as an R object, um, and say that's like the beginning. So like Europe begin, and I'm going to do the same thing and create another object to end that block. right? So that's basically creating these two sort of bookends of that fence div in R. Then I can make use of inline code. Right? So this is going to evaluate R code. It's going to evaluate this object called like Europe begin, which is going to return content visible if my parameter is Europe. If it's not Europe, it's not going to do anything, right? So I can put in some some caveats about like European data, and I can render that. Rendering types, which is fine. Uh, I am going to switch this back to HTML because I think it's a little bit quicker. Okay, and you can see that underneath our figure one here, we've got this sentence or caveats about European data. If we change it to a different continent, okay, so let's go for Asia. Okay, ah, that shouldn't be appearing. Interesting. Hmm. That did not appear yesterday. Okay. Um, I am gonna try to fix that while you work on some exercises. So if I jump back to slides, okay. So basically do a kind of similar thing. Um, and edit the Quarto file that you did in uh exercise 3. Again, to put that interactive chart in when it's HTML and otherwise show a static chart. Um, there's a good question in the chat that I don't know the answer to, but I can go and have a look at. So one of the question is like Plotly versus Giraffe, um, because Plotly can do things like textures in charts, which helps with accessibility and kind of not relying on color. I don't know if it does textures. Um, I kn I know that the accessibility of it has improved a little bit in the last couple of years, I think. So it didn't. One of the other accessibility aspects of interactive charts is can you navigate it with a keyboard? And I like Plotly charts you didn't used to be able to, but I believe you can now. I don't know about textures, but I will go and have a look. Personally, I do also kind of normally prefer the giraffe package because you have a little bit more control over um what it looks like. Okay. So if you have a go at the exercises, I am going to try and figure out why this isn't working. All right. I think I fixed it. Um, using content hidden and checking if it's not equal to Europe seems to work. Checking if it is equal to Europe and using content visible um, seems not to work, which I guess makes sense, sort of. I'll update the examples online to fix that. Although I'm very sure that the other one worked yesterday. Anyway, yeah. So using content hidden rather than content visible. Um, I guess makes sense because most content is visible by default, so you kind of want to like hide it if it's not the default. Okay. Um, the other question in the chat was around um like patterns or textures. So it looks like Plotly does do um textures or like patterns. What I don't know is if I don't think that will work with like the ggplotly conversion. I don't think. Um, Mainly because things like patterns are also relatively new to a lot of our graphics as well. Um, it might work if you construct it with the plotly functions in R, but I don't know if the ggplotly kind of conversion function would actually translate them properly. Okay. Um, how are you getting on with exercise 5 and adding in some conditional content? Are people done? Are they kind of feeling ready to move on um, to the last little bit of the workshop? Just drop a message in the chat when you're kind of ready to move on to the last section. All right, looks like a few folks are ready for the last part of the workshop. So the last part we're going to look at something like slightly different. Okay, so the idea of this section is we're going to look at parameterized report sections. Okay, so far what we've done is we've looked at how do you create multiple reports that all follow the same structure based on some parameters. What you might want to do instead of creating like 10 different reports is actually have one report but with 10 different sections in it. Okay, so you might have a section for each continent, a section for each year within one report. And so what we're going to look at is like how do you reuse content in Quarto reports, first of all. So there's a couple of different ways to do that. So one way that you can reuse R codes across either across different documents or within different sections of a document is using the file option. So in a code block, where we were putting in sort of label and fig caption, there's a file argument, and you can pass in an R file there. There's also something called include, so you can include Quarto documents within other documents. And then there's another option called knit child for working with what we call sort of child documents. So with from with using file in a code block option, okay, so you can pass in a .r file. It works with paths. So again, if you're like me and you kind of structure things and you've got all your Quarto files in one place and maybe some helper files in R in a different folder, it works with relative paths. Like you can go up multiple levels. It works really well. It's a really good way to separate out long, particularly reusable pieces of code. So things like functions. Okay, so when we're creating our parameterized ggplot2 functions, like it takes up quite a lot of space in our Quarto document, makes it a little bit harder to read. So we could separate that out into a different file and we can source that file across multiple documents. It's kind of like it's much quicker and easier than writing a whole package, but it still kind of keeps it reusable and tidy. I use this a lot for setting up sort of like using setup code across different documents. So setting a default like ggplot2 theme, loading fonts for my plots. I want them to be exactly the same across multiple documents. So I've got some R code that does that, and I just sort of source that file at the top of the script. Include is a built-in Quarto feature. right? It's called a short code, right? So you've got these like two curly brackets and then like less than and greater than signs, includes, and then the name of the Quarto document. So the idea is that you've got a main Quarto file, you've got another Quarto file with some other little bits in it that you use to, and you use include to get that into the main file. It's equivalent to copying and pasting, right? Which means you need to be a little bit careful with things like image paths. So if in your sort of sub file you have some images, but your sub file is in a different folder to your main file, it it's not going to necessarily render correctly because everything is sort of relative to that main file. It is a nice way of breaking up long documents. Um, so if you're writing, I don't know, a really long report, or you've got maybe if you've got like multiple people working on different sections of a report, sometimes it might be easier for them each to write their own section in their own separate Quarto file. You can also include R files with the include shortcut. Um, I've never done it because you don't get code block options, but you can. One thing I would recommend is you'll notice that this um, file name starts with an underscore, and that's not a coincidence. So, nice thing about Quarto is that if you start your file name with an underscore, Quarto doesn't try to render them. Okay, so if you're in a project and you try to render it, and your subfile didn't have this underscore at the start, Quarto is going to try and render that as well as the main file. And actually, you don't want to render that separately. Okay, so anything with an underscore, Quarto just ignores. Um, as a tip, that's also really useful if you're working on like a big website project or a book and you just want to render one little section to check that looks okay. Stick an underscore in front of the file name and it thinks it's not part of the project. You can render it separately. Now, unfortunately, you can't pass parameters in with include, right? What I would really want to do is have like include content.qmd, and here's the parameters that I want to pass into this parameterized Quarto document. Unfortunately, that's not a thing that exists or works. So what we can do instead is make use of an R function. Okay? So this is this sort of knit child function. Okay, so it's this idea of child documents. It's very similar to include. The idea is that you have a main Quarto file and you've got a little sub child Quarto file, and you're basically taking the contents of that child document and putting them into the main document. Okay. Now, since knit child is an R function, that means we can loop over parameters. Okay. So you can't really loop over parameters in Quarto itself, but R can definitely loop over parameters. Okay. A couple of things to be a little bit careful about with this. Like, first of all, it's a knitr feature. Okay, so this isn't gonna work out of the box if you're using like Jupyter engines or if you're like using Python. Okay, it is a knitr feature. The other thing to be a little bit careful of is if you make a change to your child's document, right, but you don't change anything else in your main Quarto file, Quarto doesn't sort of auto re-render, so it doesn't necessarily detect those changes very well. Okay? So you might need to manually re-render it, which is fine. I probably manually re-render stuff anyway, but just to be a little bit careful with that. Okay, so let's jump back and do um, a little example. Okay, so I'm gonna I'm gonna get rid of this stuff just to make it a little bit cleaner. Okay, so what I want to do is create a new R script. Okay. Um, I'm just going to call it like utils.r. Okay. I'm going to save it in the same place as my Quarto document. And in that, what I'm going to do is take out that continent plot function. Okay, so get that out of the uh, main script. And then what I can do in my main Quarto document is do file and then it's utils.r. And that just it makes the like your main Quarto document just look a little bit cleaner. It also means that if you're writing um like a separate report, but you still want that same plot to be in it, you can like do the same thing and you don't have to copy and paste it between documents. Okay, so it looks exactly the same. What I'm now going to do is create a child document. Okay, so you can call it anything you want. Ideally, again, starting with that underscore. Okay, I'm going to call it underscore child. Um, you can call it whatever you want. Okay. So what I'm going to do is create a section. So in Quarto, you create sections with hashtags. So heading like this, and I'm going to take that continent out of the main title and stick it as a section title. Okay, so this is just going to put the parameter choose continent in there. And then I'm going to take out my continent plot and put it in here as well. Okay, so this is going to create a section where the name of the section is like Europe, and in that section it has a plot. You can put any text you like in here. Basically put whatever you like in this document. Okay. So now we need to figure out a way of getting the content from this child document into our main document. So we're going to need an R code block, and we're going to use knit child. Okay. Now that's from the knit-r package. You can load knit-r as well. So you're going to have knit child. First thing you need to do is say what's the name of the child document. So child.qmd. There's an argument in here which is called quiet is equal to true. Okay, so you've noticed that like when we're rendering our Quarto documents, we get all this stuff printed when we're rendering. We don't really want to bring that into the report, so we set quiet to true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this, and as a variable, can be anything you like. And then I'm going to use cat to print that output. Okay. Um, and put in some new lines. Okay. So what we still need to do is figure out the parameters. Okay. Now, unfortunately, um, well, not necessarily unfortunately, what we don't really want to actually do is pass the parameters in at a document level, right? It's because the parameter isn't applying to the whole document. It's applying to a single section of the document. So what I'm going to do here is just create a list called params. And in that list, I'm going to say choose continent is equal to, let's go like Americas. Okay. Now, because this is a list, the way we access elements in it is still going to be like params $sign. You don't have to use a list, right? This could be any variable in R. The only real reason I'm keeping it as params is so that you can reuse the same functions and content across different parameterized reports or across parameterized sections. So I'm going to render this, and you should see the section for Americas with that. Okay. Now, that doesn't quite look right. It's kind of there, right? What you've actually got here is just like it's like you've written a Quarto document, but on top of the HTML. Okay? We need to make one little change to this, which in our code block we do output and then as is. And that basically says take this output that comes out here and render it. Okay, so whatever this markdown is, actually just render it like as it is. Okay, so if we render that, okay, you now have your report with um, your section heading and your chart. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to loop over all of the continents. Right? So first thing we'll do, get all that list of all of the continents. Okay, so this is the same as when we were looking at using per to map over the um, different document parameters. Okay, so we get getMinder $ continents. Nope, continent. Okay. And then you could use per again if you like. I'm just gonna do a for loop. Um, it's very much up to you. So we go across all of the continents and we do this same thing in each loop. But in here, we do all continents I. Okay. So now when we render this, okay, so you've got your report, okay, so you got different sections, one for each um, continent. Plots are changing. You can put whatever text you like in. Okay, so you can use again inline code to say, you know, it's increasing over time, it's decreasing, it's flattening off. Kind of create that parameterized text there as well. Okay, so that's kind of how you can create parameterized sections rather than parameterized reports as such. Okay. Um, you can put in figure captions and figure labels based on the parameters as well. If you were going to need some sort of cross-referencing within a plot, or if you wanted those captions, basically anything that you can do in a normal Quarto file, you could do in that child document instead. Okay. So very last exercise for you to have a go at. Okay. Um, the second part is probably more important, but have a go at separating out the sort of bar chart function you've got into a separate R script and then load it using file instead to keep your Quarto file nice and tidy looking. And then have a go at creating a child file with the year and then followed by the chart and render the document with a section for every year in the data. Okay. And then we'll have some time at the end to go through any questions you've got. Okay, so do feel free to stick your questions in the chat, and I'll have a look at the ones that are coming in at the moment. Okay. Okay. If you do want to keep working on that last exercise, do feel free Um, but we'll just do a very brief kind of round up and answer the kind of couple of question that's come in. So one of the questions that has come in is a question that um is a really common problem for people thinking about using Quarto, and that is when you have a lot of people who might want to review or like add to the kind of narrative content of a report, they might not be very familiar with Quarto. They might not never have opened like an ID and will likely never need to or want to. So things like track changes in Word documents is like a kind of preferred method of editing. And obviously you can go from Quarto to Word, but it's quite hard to go backwards. So if someone makes some suggestions in a Word document, how do you get those back in to your Quarto sort of source document? Um, it is unfortunately at this moment in time quite a difficult problem, and it's been a difficult problem for a long time. Um, there are there are some options. Um, so what I would say is you can do the way we've done this in the past is through GitHub. Um, so it's not quite as I guess like nice a UI as like track changes in Word, but you can open a pull request in GitHub and you can access it through the website and you can add comments and you can make suggestions. And even for people who have never used Git before, it's there's enough parallels, I think, with Word that it kind of works. Um, there's a couple of resources being um put in the chat. So there's a package called Trackdown. Um, it was originally built to solve this problem with R Markdown rather than Quarto. I think it does work with Quarto. I don't know if it works with Word documents. I think it does work with Google Docs, um, and can pull things sort of back into your Quarto files. Um, there's another resource that's relatively new called Quartorium, um, which is supposed to be a kind of like editor that lets you do like collaborative editing on Quarto documents. So you can share a link with collaborators, um, and they can edit the text and add comments. Um, the code is hidden from collaborators, so they can't like make suggestions about changing plots, code or anything like that. Um, but when they make a change, it gets committed to a branch in GitHub, so you can pull those changes in or reject them if you don't like your collaborators' ideas. Um, so that's one solution. Um, unless it's a Quarto is a very urgent thing for you, um, the developers of Quarto are like aware that this is a feature that would make it so much easier for a lot more people to use Quarto. So they are currently working on like Quarto version 2, and one of the features of Quarto version 2 will be the ability to do collaborative editing, um, like this the same kind of way you do it in a Word document. That's going to be one of the new features of Quarto 2. And they said the first release of Quarto 2 will be in like about 6 months' time. So if and unless you absolutely need to use Quarto tomorrow. Um, if you can't get any of the other tools to kind of work well for you, then wait about 6 months, and hopefully that problem will be solved for you. Right. Um, all right. Um, so just kind of like as a brief reminder to finish up, workshop resources are up online. There's some additional resources up here. So some help for writing functions. So if you're doing like parameterized plots and you need a little bit more help. Quarto documentation is really, really good. It's if you got a question about Quarto, the answer is very likely in there. Um, there's this workshop from Cara Thompson. Some of you might have been at Cara's ggplot2 workshop earlier today. Cara's great. She's got some resources on parameterizing ggplot plots as well, which is really useful. Um, this is a nice blog post from Andy about parameterized presentations. So kind of similar to what we've done today, but rather than doing HTML documents or reports, it's specifically looking at presentations in Quarto. And I've kind of got this little list of data science resources, and there's a lot of Quarto stuff in there as well. And what I'll do is I'll add the links that have kind of been posted in the chat um, for collaborative editing and Plotly and whatnot to this list as well. So you can always come back to them, and these slides will stay up online. So unless you have any other questions, um, thank you very much for coming along. I hope it's been useful.
Thanks, Nicola. That was great. That was really well organized, and there was a lot of new information for me.